I haven't been to England, though. I keep going to France. I need to visit other places.
Yeah, we'll have to go at some point.
Yes. At some point you will. I mean, if you love architecture, definitely London right now, I have to say, having been away for 29 years or whatever it is, London is a great mix right now of the old and the really quite cutting edge. So it's definitely worth seeing.
Really large projects like the Shard. That's been completed for a bit of years now. But
yes, and the Tate Modern and the Foster Bridge and the city of London has changed so much with the Gherkin and then
the Gherkin.
crazy old Gherkin.
Are you from London?
No, I grew up in Bath in the West Country, which is neoclassical, Georgian city, where they really don't let you do anything.
What do you mean by that?
As in, if you want to do groovy architecture, don't go to Bath. Because my father, he bought and sold houses and would spend, the love of his life was redoing old houses. And he did that in Bath, and you couldn't do anything on the exterior. The preservation rules are so intense. So he would do pretty kind of extreme interiors, but there was nothing. And it was this city. It was like Santa Barbara.
Right.
Imagine trying to do architecture in Santa Barbara.
Yeah.
It's the same thing.
Yeah, I have an aunt who they live in Sacramento, and they live in a very desirable community, but the HOA has very, very extreme and tight regulations. So all the houses are this really kind of ugly mud brown. So when you visit there and you don't know the community, you think this is not a great place, but it's actually very exclusive. But she's a bit of a rebel, so she did the interior kind of crazy, and she had this idea of painting all of her walls different colors. So at night, when you drive by, you have kind of brown, and then through the windows, crazy colors coming through.
That sounds great.
And it works well, I think.
That actually sounds like it would make a good photo.
Maybe
you should photograph it. That would be interesting.
Yeah.
A sort of reverse Ed Ruscha or something. Because he did those blank exteriors, didn't he?
Right.
And this is the interior.
Yeah.
How interesting. I love that. That sounds very much like the sort of thing my father would do.
Is that how you got into the architecture world, was through your father?
I would say so, yes. I mean, really, I definitely grew up. I can't remember a time when my father and my mother, with support from my mother, who was part-time, her job was teaching, but she was also kind of my father's partner in these projects. And he would buy a house, we'd move in, me and my sister, and then later my second sister, who was much younger than me. And he would then spend the next few months or a couple of years redoing the house, not exactly like a flipper who buys and sells as fast as possible at as high a profit as possible, but more like this was his own personal art project. So he would work with my mother. They would mess around with the house, and then as soon as it was done to what he considered a completed job, then he was bored and it would be on to the next one. So we moved multiple times, all within the centre of the city of Bath, and everything was always in a state of change, and with each new project he'd have a new kind of style that he wanted to play with, or a new set of colours, or so I grew up just sort of understanding that environment mattered. And then now he had not gone to architecture school. He had gone to art school, and then he got into set design and decoration. So he was I think he'd like to have been an architect. Yeah. And I think the fact that I felt kind of his frustration at not having studied architecture, I think did propel me in that direction. As it turned out, once I got to architecture school, I went to the Bartlett in the UK, I kind of realised that I wasn't necessarily cut out to be an architect. I do think you've just done your exam, and congratulations, because I admire architects so much. I did 4 years of study and I didn't do that final exam. And there is a kind of commitment to detail and an extraordinary commitment to detail, level of detail, and an ability to sort of stay with the project sometimes for literally years, that didn't necessarily didn't necessarily suit my personality particularly. So I really love architecture, but I kind of sense that I probably wasn't going to be an architect. I think it involves a toolbox of skills
The timeline of projects is an interesting thing, and this was something you realized in school.
Yeah, I don't think so. I did a 4th year out where I worked in an architect's office for a year, and I think that's when I started to learn about the timeline. And I also learned how in school you'd design an opera house, and then you'd go work for an architect, and you'd be specifying door handles. And
yeah. Yeah.
So I did learn that, and I think I realized at that point that an exceptional few got to be designing the opera houses and got to be doing the big thinking. And, for a lot of people, the daily grind of being an architect is specifying the door handles.
Yeah.
And I don't want to dismiss. I'm not in any way denigrating specifying door handles. It's just that
we need them.
Yeah, exactly. And when the door handle isn't right, it makes you crazy. Yeah. It's more that I realised that I wasn't necessarily that well suited to the work myself. That's all.
Yeah, I think it's there's a big difference between architecture school, as you're outlining, versus the profession. And people really love school. They love creating things, making things out of cardboard, presenting, and all of this stuff. And you get into the profession and you realize that it's a lot of times very different. But I still feel like the architecture education is very valuable. Even if
it really is. Right. Yes.
Yeah, but even in your position, I was going to say, even in your position, which is kind of a stupid question, I guess, because you have a show about design and architecture, but the skill set that you have to host a show, like you do, is very different from what an architect's skill set would be, right?
Totally. Starting with speaking in a language people understand.
I struggle with this day to day. When I'm doing grocery shopping, I struggle with this. Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
No. One of the other things that made me realize while I was at architecture school that I probably wasn't fully on the right track was that I had spent 18 years growing up within the family that I was in with a father who was absolutely passionate about design and architecture and art, but spoke in kind of regular language. And then because he hadn't been trained otherwise. And then I went to architecture school, and it was in the 1980s, which became like the decade of theory, theory speak. And I was really perplexed. I really didn't understand this kind of jargon language that we all had to learn as architecture students to then be able to kind of communicate amongst ourselves, which was ultimately kind of exclusionary. And so I think became quite conscious while at college that that the communication of architecture and design was something that that I was kind of concerned with, let's say. So the way I wound up getting to where I am now was very unplanned and unmapped, circuitous. But I think there were certain things that I became aware of fairly early on that when I look back, they kind of key into what I'm doing now. So that sense of communication and how you express architecture was something I was thinking about while at school.
Were there other things, though, before DNA started that looking back were signifiers that you might be doing something like this? Like, did you perform or do interviews or anything like that? Because I find kind of this kind of thing to be kind of a performance in a way, or public speaking and things. Did you do any of those things?
No, I didn't. Although I definitely was probably one of the biggest talkers in my year at school. I've always been pretty gregarious and a chatterbox, and I've never been shy of people. So those might be helpful tools for doing this. But actually, having said that, even as I really wasn't shy and I was quite gregarious, if you had asked me at age 19 to get in front of a crowded room and speak publicly, or if you had asked me then to take a microphone and go and interview people, actually I would have been quite scared of that. It was a different set of skills than just being very social and kind of feeling comfortable with strangers. So to answer your question about how I wound up here and what might have been the early signifiers, in super brief, what happened was I did 4 years of architecture school, of which one of those years was out in the field, partly spent in an architect's office, partly spent on working 6 months on a building site set up by the Bartlett. That resulted in an essay that was partly for school, but ended up in a magazine called The Architect's Journal. Through that, it's a long story, but I wound up being offered an editing job on the Architectural Review, which was a sister publication to the Architect's Journal. That my first assignment when I joined that magazine in 1987 was to come to LA and put together a special issue on LA. That also was a whole chapter of accidents that got me to that place, why I was even asked to do that, basically because the editor they were meant to be working with in the US had agreed to do it over a liquid lunch, and kind of that arrangement had been forgotten about.
I read about this.
Right, and so I wound up being told to sort of just salvage the situation. So anyway, came to LA, met the so-called, subversive architects of the time, who are now the establishment,
right,
and thought LA was baffling, weird, but kind of really amazing and interesting. Wound up moving here in 91, being still within the architecture world, editing a small publication, literally very small, the newsletter for the local AIA. Then we had the Rodney King riots of April of 1992, profoundly galvanizing event for many, many people, including many of us in the architecture world, who I think, if I may speak for them as well as myself, were kind of woken up to the fact that there was more to Los Angeles and the urban and built environment than, formerly experimental houses, which was kind of what a lot of people were working on and talking about back then. For me, following, sort of figuring out a way to explore those issues led me ultimately to this station, because in the immediate aftermath of the Rodney King riots, KCRW, which I would listen to driving around, KCRW launched a radio show called Which Way LA, hosted by a fantastic veteran journalist called Warren Olney. And Which Way LA became a daily show that was established to explore what happened, what were the causes of the civil unrest. And it was partly exploring kind of the urban fabric, but it was also exploring politics and economics and ethnic relations, and racial relations, I should say, and all the tensions that had somehow just kind of collided, and exploded in that event. And I found that show to be so incredibly interesting, and to be, as I say, just talking about the urban environment, talking about LA, but from all these multiple perspectives. And I just resolved to get involved with that show. And without any experience, I had no experience in radio. So I just sort of set my heart on becoming a producer on that show. I knew I had editorial skills. I already knew how to kind of research and construct a narrative. I'd been doing that in print. So I had those kind of basic skills, but I didn't come in as an interviewer. I didn't come in as even thinking about having my own show. I just wanted to be Warren's producer on Which Way LA.
Right.
And I and so I called the station, and the way the station worked was you could come and volunteer. So we had people that are passionate about music, and they'd volunteer for the music shows and etc. So it really took a long time. I did not do this right away in 1992. I just set my heart on it. And then several years passed, and I got myself into a position where I became just a freelance writer, and writing about design, sometimes writing for people, sometimes, writer for hire for architects, sometimes writing for magazines. I did a lot of writing for the New York Times about West Coast design. And while doing that, I started to volunteer here. And then I ultimately became a regular producer. And then time passed, and I kept up these parallel lives, producing Which Way LA, which also became a national show called To The Point. So I was working on those two shows here, but I was also still keeping up the writing about design. And one thing led to another. And our former general manager, Ruth Seymour, and our current president and general manager, Jennifer Ferro, decided that it was time for us to really start covering design and architecture in LA. And so I wound up becoming the person that hosted that show. And when that started, it was just with a one-off show that I did. And they encouraged me, Ruth encouraged me to sort of get behind the mic and talk, actually, ironically and coincidentally, about the Rem Koolhaas plan for LACMA, which involved tearing down 4 buildings at LACMA. And there was a lot of people that upset about that. And Ruth said, we've got to talk about that. And basically, I was sort of stuck in front of a mic. And this has been a long way of answering your question about kind of having the confidence to get in front of a microphone. And I was terrified. I was literally terrified. I literally thought I was going to vomit into the microphone.
Okay, and so literally.
Yes. So I was this gregarious person who also was terrified of going in front of the microphone. And I mean, it's kind of amazing I was given that chance. I'm truly grateful I was given that chance and then allowed to kind of learn on the job, and that's what happened. The intervening years have been about learning on the job.
Right. I mean, she must have recognized some kind of talent within you, because that's a big jump to go from behind the scenes to now in front of a microphone. I mean, that's a radical thing. Yeah,
she knew that I was writing articles, and she herself was an avid reader of the New York Times, and she knew that I was writing for the New York Times, so she knew that I was capable of interviewing people. But yes, to go from there to turning that into being behind a mic is a little journey in itself. And some people are extremely gifted at it. I mean, obviously I watched Warren for years. Warren's amazing. He's absolutely amazing. Right. And then thinking about how you take what you've learned from other people, but make it work for your own personality or your own style, right. Which is, I could never be Warren.
Right.
So I'm never going to be him and have his particular skill set. So how am I going to do this that seems to work with the skill set that I have?
So at what point it's DNA started in 2002, right?
Yes.
So at what point did you start to feel really comfortable with that position of the show, and that you started to establish your own way of doing things and your own personality, or whatever, however you would describe it?
When did it start feeling comfortable? There was a certain point where Ruth stepped in and said the show was getting too inside baseball, as in too much oriented to the design and architecture community, which was ironic because the one goal I had right at the outset was to talk about design and architecture in a way that would go beyond the bubble of the architecture world and that would go out to the general community. And even though that was my goal, I clearly wasn't accomplishing it initially. And Ruth did criticize the show at a certain point for being too insidery. And she had me work with Jennifer Ferro, who's our current president and general manager. And that was really good, bringing in a non-cognoscenti voice to be part of the process, and kind of helped. That's always been the challenge. And I think that it was maybe it was when I started to get that direct input from Jennifer. Had produced good food, so she'd kind of worked, not that in a way food is not analogous at all, because everybody can understand food, but anyway
cooking shows work for
everybody. Yeah. So but anyway, there was I think when I started to, I think there was this point where I was trying to sort of produce and host the show just myself completely on my own. And I think I've definitely benefited from having somebody else involved with the show. Currently, I have a producer called Avishai Artsy, and it's really, really good to run design and architecture stories by someone who didn't go to architecture school and get their feedback on what works, because it's amazing how we within the design community have kind of assumptions about what everybody knows about, and then it turns out that actually everybody doesn't know about it at all.
Yeah.
And one has to be reminded of that. Yeah. So I think there was a combination of really getting to that point where I had a much clearer idea of how to bridge the communities.
And is that mainly through how you speak, like not using certain words or not going on certain tangents? Or
Yeah, exactly. Not using certain words. Yes, palimpsest is not a word that you use often on
gestalt.
Party. It's often they all seem to start with P, the words that you're not supposed to use. But yeah, certain words and even just names, little things like knowing to quickly back announce a name that might be completely obvious within the architecture world. Even Rem Koolhaas, you could say Rem Koolhaas, and all architects will know that name. There's no explainer needed. But once you go beyond out into the to the wider community, and for us at a public radio station, our community is generally college level educated. This is a very educated audience, but still doesn't necessarily know all the references, so it has to sort of back announce. So you have to kind of be accessible but also not patronize the audience. So it's finding that balance. For me, there's things like, I know over the years people have said, I like your style because you laugh. Like there's things like that. There's sort of choosing what level of fun you're going to have with the topic at times, not being sort of simplistic, but also not being overly serious with a topic that can be quite serious. So it's finding a place that has some levity in it. Again, so people don't feel that this is kind of an alienating and serious topic.
Right. It's a really strange thing how certain ways of speaking work in everyday life, or at least you think they work. And then when you get on a microphone, you speak that way, and you listen back, it doesn't work. And it's also bizarre that when you're explaining something, it's very easy to sound like an arrogant asshole. It very quickly, that line, like you go over that line. And it's something that I think for the two of us, we're always thinking about, but it's a very elusive idea to grasp or skill set to earn, I guess.
Right. And then we're not allowed to say a-hole.
Oh, yeah, that's right. You're in public radio, and also your format's shorter.
7 words.
Right. So that's got to be super tough because you want to balance the more formal parts of the conversation where it's like kind of hardcore information you're getting out, but you don't want it to be super dry either. Right. And you can't swear. We can swear.
You can swear on a podcast, so that's definitely a big difference. Yeah, you want to get out information. And then the other thing is you're talking about generally a visual realm, but you can't spend too long on the visuals because that's the part that's harder to grasp on radio. So you have to really reduce the visuals actually to really a short summary, a brief brushstroke of the visuals, and then go more to the ideas, because the ideas are easier to comprehend on radio. Right. Obviously, if you're very good at describing things, then you can spend time with the visuals, but even then you can't spend too long with it before I think listeners find that part harder to listen to, especially if you're sort of listening and it's just sort of, you're just driving along, especially if you're listening to the broadcast in real time. If you're listening to a carefully composed podcast that's about beautiful writing, you might sort of actively pay more attention. But even though many of our listeners now do listen to all of the shows that we do online rather than broadcast, still we do have that audience that's catching us just in real time in the car. And so we do have to sort of get information out or the story out in a pretty direct and accessible way. Yeah.
Do you ever listen to your shows?
Yes. But not... I don't usually listen to them in the car driving around. We listen to them before they air, just to make sure they sound okay before they go out, which is a different way of listening because we're kind of actively listening to check everything's okay. I don't do so much of casual listening to my own shows. In fact, I find it in fact, it's horrifying. And I'm not the only one. There's other people at the station cannot bear to listen to themselves in that casual way. will listen in a studio to make. It's really odd. It's actually really odd that. Why is that? Why does one have the confidence to go on air, have the what's the word I'm looking for? Perfectionism to listen and check and make sure everything sounds good as it goes out, and then run away from just listening to it when it airs. It's so strange.
I don't know. It's listening back is never fun, but we do the audio and audio editing in-house, so
he does.
Rather I do, so I'm
I cannot
forced to
listen to it.
At this point, I've gotten used to my own voice, so it's like, whatever.
And then we added video recently, and that's even worse than
listening.
See, that's the part I hate. Radio, when I got involved with radio back in the early 90s, it wasn't online. It was, you didn't know what people looked like who were on air. They had that they had that saying, a person has a face for radio, which frankly wasn't a compliment. It was, they had a face for radio, they wouldn't be on TV. But I love that about radio. I loved actually the visual anonymity about it, which also is kind of strange and contradictory when I love this visual world. But yes, since then we've become exposed on so many media and in so many ways. And that was the other thing. In the early days, your stuff went out and then it was gone. It was evanescent. You did your show, it wasn't even saved.
Did you see the show take a big turn, like since a few years ago, with all of the podcasts being out and like people tuning into listening things more and more while they're running, while they're driving, while they're doing things?
Through the internet, you mean?
Yeah. And social media and all of that. Did that make a change on like how many listeners you guys had or the type of audience you have?
Yes. I mean, to be honest, I don't myself monitor the numbers, but there was definitely a point where DNA it went online, and we were really encouraged, or I was really encouraged, to develop the kind of online side of DNA. But this was not just because of the show's content itself, it was because of actually where media was going, which was podcasting was a piece of it, but the bigger picture was that where our focus as a broadcast station used to be primarily the mainstream audience. That is the general audience that's looking for general topics, and that's where our underwriting was focused. As what the internet enabled was the cultivation of niche audiences. So DNA was a niche show initially, and the niche shows weren't necessarily where the niche shows weren't necessarily where KCRW was kind of, or any station would put its emphasis. It would put its emphasis on the shows that would have wide appeal.
Right.
But what's happened in the intervening years is there's been much more emphasis put on the niche topics, of which DNA is one. Probably you could say bookworm, books, so that's the bigger thing that I've been aware of. Yes, and in terms of kind of the way we talk about our shows, but also to your point, what was I going to say? Oh yes. So the other thing is, in terms of the explosion of podcast shows and specifically podcast shows about design, I guess the conversation I've had with myself and with colleagues is, okay, does one... Sorry, I don't think I ever had any lunch.
It's lunchtime.
It's true. I actually have not had lunch.
It is lunchtime, actually.
It's now 3:20. So DNA used to be one of few shows about design and architecture. Now it's one of many. And but most of the podcast shows about design and architecture, not all, but most, are not rooted in place. They tend to be about design and architecture themes that you could listen to in Brooklyn or San Francisco or Austin or LA, and it'll be about a topic that is relevant to people in all those cities. It's more a kind of a universal. I find they're talking about universal design themes a lot of the time. And what DNA is rooted in LA, primarily. We sometimes take on topics that are relevant to people in LA, but not necessarily about LA. But primarily, DNA is about LA. So what makes it different from some of the podcasts is what we might talk about on the show, we will also talk about at a panel discussion that takes place at LACMA or at SCI-Arc. We're very plugged into the community. And in that sense, we are like other KCRW shows. We are plugged into the community. That's what our station is. And that's what DNA is. And I hope it will continue to be. And so in that sense, it's doing something different from some of the other podcast shows. It is deeply embedded in community to the point that we get engaged with issues. We get engaged with what's going on in housing. We get engaged with what's going on in transportation. We get invited to be involved with public discussions. We sometimes initiate public discussions.
I think that's probably the best way to do what you're doing, because you're not just putting things on air. You're kind of, I don't know, like linking things together in the radio and physically and with the community. And I think like what you just pointed out, the fact that the show is rooted to its place where it was created, I think it makes it very unique.
I mean, also Los Angeles is a interesting city anyway. I think if this was for some reason located in a really small town where nothing was happening, then maybe it would be a struggle. But Los Angeles is it's interesting in part because it's kind of plagued with a lot of problems, and there's a lot of exciting things happening too, right?
Totally.
So I feel like whatever conversations you have about this place would for sure be interesting and also be applicable to many other places.
Yes, and they must be, because I'm amazed to discover that how many listeners, and I can't give you a number, but we have listeners outside of LA, and I'm kind of fascinated that they want to listen to, a half-hour show talking about, what's going on with Santa Monica Airport, or or a specific building project in downtown or something like that. It's kind of amazing to me. But no, LA is ceaselessly fascinating for sure.
So when you came over here, you didn't come here knowing you were going to move and stay here, right? Initially.
Not in 1987 when I came for the Architecture Review, no.
But you decided to stay here. I'm wondering, if you had first visited Los Angeles today, do you think you would also choose to stay here in the long term? Because LA's changed a lot since that time.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I do think about that. And before I met you two, I did an interview with someone else who actually called Paul Fortune, who's an interior designer who came from my own country, as it happens, the UK. And he came here in the 60s and 70s. Whoa. For him, that was his golden era. Yeah. And he now sort of can't handle LA. He finds it just, jammed, and he sees LA as having had a kind of visual logic at that time that it's completely lost, and there's just all this overbuilding that kind of doesn't make any sense, and it doesn't make visual sense, or he sees it as a place that's become kind of really stressful and hard to manage. And so I'm very aware that people come, wherever you go when you're in your 20s that was the perfect time for that place, So
because you're in your 20s.
Yeah. So one has to kind of be aware of that, and look through, make sure, then try and be objective, because whatever I might say about the 1990s when I first came here is going to be probably partly subjective, but I will say the 1990s, the early 90s, was a completely fascinating time to be here, because there was the Rodney King riots, there was the 1994 earthquake. Those coincided with a moment of transition for LA. They coincided, and they probably helped steer in and also steer the direction forward. But when I arrived here, it was the end of 40 years of total car dependence, pretty much, for LA, and planning that was car oriented, and it had reached its zenith, and now the city was just starting to rebuild its mass transit system. It's taken a long time. There was also immigration that there's obviously waves and waves and waves of immigration into LA, but certainly there was immigration in the 70s and 80s that was really transforming LA by the time we got to the 90s, and it was a time of I think that was, well, let me stop there and just say it was also a time It was the end of the time when LA was an affordable place to live, when you could come here as a young architect, or artist, and you could pay the rent. And people came here to sort of do projects. LA's always had that allure. You'd get big skies,
right,
big horizons, metaphorically, literally. You had this sense of the infinite, sense of the possible, sense of horizons, and you could afford to get yourself a reasonably big space to work in or live in and test stuff. You didn't immediately need to be selling. You didn't immediately need to be earning a pretty decent salary to pay the rent. And LA was slightly off the beaten track, even though there was, a certain influx of people who were very creative, who saw LA as a kind of very interesting place to be. It was still rather laughed at in New York, laughed at in London, laughed at in Paris, wasn't seen as a kind of a place kind of worth talking about. So people sort of came here, and this is exactly what Paul Fortune was talking about, and it was even more so in the 70s. This was a place where you came and just experimented. Frank Gehry's talked about that in the 50s. He said LA was great, relative to New York. Nobody was watching you. You could do your thing. Now LA is global city. Right. Everybody's trying to get here. The rents are crazy. The mass transit is being shoehorned in on a city that isn't really formed to work for mass transit. So the transit doesn't work. Everybody's stuck in traffic. It's become insanely expensive to live here, and people are watching. So it has, and I should say, to Paul Fortune's point, while LA was untenable, the way LA was planned, the urban planning of LA was untenable. You couldn't have a place that just kept on sprawling forever outwards, that was completely car dependent, had miles upon miles of roads and parking lots. I mean, obviously one couldn't maintain development like that. However, there was a kind of a visual logic. It was kind of logical unto itself, and add to that, because of Hollywood, because of the things that made LA unique. You wouldn't have Hollywood in other places that were planned like LA. You wouldn't have a Hollywood in San Diego or Arizona. You had Hollywood in LA. So LA, and then it had the mountains. So LA developed its own specific and unique kind of identity. And I do think it's losing that. I do think it's losing that. I think we've now got a lot of housing that's been built by conglomerates. It could be in any city in America.
The multifamilies, the ones that are
multifamilies,
6-story, 5-story.
And the towers. There's a few projects where you've got local architects getting in there and adding something that's particular and distinctive. But there's a lot of very generic stuff that's going up. Now, I know there will be people who will say, if you came to LA in the 70s, you'd find a lot of generic rubbish as well. I know they will. But anyway, LA, I do think, had some kind of distinct characteristics that are going. I think there's a lot of people who now come to LA, live on the East Side, never go to the beach, are not interested in that distinctive LA kind of beach culture that was part of the experience here, are setting up businesses that could be in Brooklyn. So in that sense, to your question, would I move here now if I came and dipped my toe in LA now? I don't know. I don't know, because this is the paradox. When I lived in London, I was an urban person. I rode my bike. I believe in recycling. I kind of had a horror of kind of, mass consumption for sort of its own sake, the exploitation of resources to absurd degrees. So intellectually, I would look at a place like LA and think, that's awful. But subjectively, I found LA to be completely captivating. Now, LA's trying to be more sensible about things. Even as McMansions get bigger and bigger and bigger, it is trying to be more sustainable. It's got bike lanes and it's trying to do transit-oriented planning and all of that, which all makes sense. And yet, at the same time, something of the character of the place is gone. So it's all very contradictory.
Cities are very confusing things.
Yes.
I mean, we lived in New York for some time, and it was, and we're not there anymore, obviously. And being able to look back on our experience, I would hope that we have kind of a clearer view of what we think and felt about New York City. And more and more, I feel like that our time there, it was like New York was kind of a ghost of itself. That the New York that everyone, that for us at least, when we moved there, we thought we were going to experience and see and witness. It's kind of, there's just traces of it, or there's like fake versions of it, sort of. And we had this this very I don't know what this idea that we were going to move to Los Angeles, and Los Angeles must be cheaper because it's the west coast. It's got to be cheaper than New York City. No, it's not. It's not cheaper than New York City. It's expensive out here.
Because all the New Yorkers have moved out here.
That's it. Yeah, we're one of those people.
It's the New Yorkers, and it's the Londoners, and it's the people from Paris, Parisians, and those are just the people from the Eastern Europe. Then there's people coming from everywhere else. Yeah. So the rents have gone up. But if you want to find New York, go to Mexico City. That's where
someone else was telling us this too.
New York of the 70s is now in Mexico City.
Really?
We went there last year. My husband, who was in New York during that period that you felt the traces of, or hoped to capture the traces of, he played at CBGB's. He was of that period. And he goes on and on and on about New York of that period, which is now gone. We went to Mexico City last year. He said, it's exactly like New York in the 1970s and 80s, because it's still got, it's just not overly manicured, you know? Right. It's not overly curated. It's still, edge is an overused word, but there's that feeling of edge. And there's that feeling of, there's still just kind of regular businesses, cheek by jowl, with avant-garde artists. You know, it's not like the entire place is sort of hedge fund managers alongside artists who are kind of bankrolled by a partner or a spouse, you know, because who's a hedge fund person, because you can't possibly afford to just, you know, get a studio in Soho. I mean, it just all feels so you know, to use a word that architecture theorists love, simulacra. It's become sort of simulacra. Right. But Mexico City doesn't feel like simulacra.
Gotcha.
It feels real.
Okay, we got to move cities again to Mexico City. I did want to ask, so you've been interviewing people for many years now. What's the toughest interview you've had to do?
Well, you know, dare I say it, some of the toughest are some of the architects who don't speak normal language.
Right.
And then we have to go in and unpack what they've said in post-production. You know, we have to edit. I'm trying to think if there's been any of those interviews where the guest was sort of hated me, you know, or was really rude. You know, there's got to have been some of those interviews where I just felt like the person didn't like me very much. And so it was a little bit difficult.
We've had a few ourselves where people name drop, reference other architects and things, but the references are so specific. Like Graham Coolhouse, I would not expect the average person to know him, but in the moment of the interview, fine. If you want a reference from Coolhouse, we can let it go. Our listenership, probably a lot of architects and designers anyway. But if you start referencing, I don't know, I'm blanking out, but someone else really specific, and it becomes a really difficult interview because everything in the interview is kind of based on all these references that no one knows about, and sometimes we don't even know them. And even as an interviewer, you find yourself kind of tuning out because it's like, in order to really have to care about this conversation, I would have had to read about 30 books, you know, and memorized a lot of the names in these books. And that's a tough thing sometimes.
Right.
Yeah.
Actually, you've just reminded me, and I won't name names, but there is somebody who is high up in, I guess, the museum world who I interviewed way back when, and he was just incredibly boring.
I love that as a really simple statement, just boring.
Yeah. In fact, I think my husband, who's always been incredibly supportive, and I have to credit him with giving me a lot of the confidence to do all this. And in fact, I should say, let me tell you, first of all, I'll say that my husband said something like he wanted to kill himself listening to the interview. It's like, oh my God, that interview went out on air. And if he wanted to kill himself, how many other people did too? But you've just reminded me. You asked me really at the outset of this conversation about kind of, I guess, getting the confidence or whatever it was that took me to being on mic. I should credit my husband, who is called Robin Bennett Stein, and he has this background as a musician. And I grew up in this household with a father who I really loved, and who's my late father. He passed away, but I really loved him, and he really inspired me with all things visual, but he didn't like badly played instruments or myself or my sisters or my mother singing in the house. He would like hold his ears and go, that's horrible. So I, as a consequence, was very unconfident about singing or even just sort of in the shower. And then I met Robin, who became my husband, and he would just like sing, completely carefree. And he got me over this feeling of fear of singing badly, essentially. He gave me the confidence to sing badly in the house. And I think that was key, pivotal to having the confidence to go on mic and do interviews. Really? Yes. So I thank him for that. Robin Bennett Stein.
Gotcha. Yes. We have to do more singing at home, I guess.
On your own time, yeah.
On my own time. The confidence thing is a really tough aspect. I mean, I find myself in interviews, I still get nervous on occasion, but it's totally random, it feels like. Like sometimes if we have a bigger guest, I'm fine. And it's a smaller guest, I get really nervous. Or we'll be talking to someone, and you know how it is when you're interviewing, you want to maintain engagement with the guests. You want to listen to what they're saying, but you're also thinking possibly what's the next question going to be. And for me, my brain doesn't work out that well. So most of the time it ends up with just really long silence. Because I had this weird existential moment where I realize that I'm in a room with two other people, and then I zoom out and I realize that I'm on Earth, and then suddenly I think, what am I thinking about though? I should be, and then the guest is staring at me. Does that ever happen to you?
Where I just go into a long silence?
Yeah.
Luckily, not too often. There were a couple of occasions in the past where I sort of had a mental freeze over something I was going to ask. So there was a couple of occasions, but I've pretty much got past that, and that's from watching Warren, I think, and some of my colleagues. I have colleagues, Madeline, Steve Chidget. I mean, there's real pros at the station, and so I've definitely learned through watching to not have long silences. That's pretty important actually in radio. Well, I will say that editing, if you interview in advance of airing, you've obviously got a lot of latitude to sit there silently. But sometimes part of the job is making people feel at ease. And so you don't really want to fall into just silences if you can avoid it, because then they don't feel like they're in good hands. You know? They don't feel like they're being led. Because that's the other thing with an interview. The skill of an interview, I guess, is making something, and you've already alluded to it, but it's making something sound like a loose conversation, chat, when in fact it's directed, and in fact it's got a story arc, and you are going from one place to the other, and you do have an end in sight. And that's probably also the difference, to get back to your question, Marina, about podcast versus air, or you asked something along those lines. Something that's very different about what we do with DNA and with our other shows is they're short. They have a finite and exact amount of time that they have to fill. And they have segments that can be, 5 minutes, and you have to get from beginning to end and have a clear narrative in that space of time. And some podcasts are just these wandering conversations, and they can be. That's fine. That's what they have the latitude to be, but it's not what we can be. We can't just sort of meander on, chit chat. And
that's because you guys are a public radio station. You feel like you have responsibility to the listeners. Like, what do you think makes
responsibility? It's that we have a finite amount of time, and that because we're talking about as I said, a relatively niche topic, but we still have a mainstream audience beyond that niche topic. So it has to be kind of fairly directed and clear.
Yeah.
So there's kind of a story arc. So we sort of map out questions before we do the interview, which have a starting point and an end point. Now, obviously, if one's not recording live, you can deviate from that. But then in editing, we try and sort of edit it back to an ebb and to an arc of a story. And I learned that from Warren, and again, my colleagues. Madeline's brilliant at doing that. But Warren would do an hour show where we would maybe talk to 5 different people about some policy issue, and Warren had this way of, and we would map out the shows in advance, who we were going to go to first, what we were going to get from that guest, so that we would then go to the next guest to have that guest respond, and then we would go to the third guest who would bring in a counterpoint to the first 2 guests. So we'd have even though it was live and there was a level that we couldn't control, we still had sort of planned the arc of the conversation, and we do that as well with our one-on-one interviews.
That is a tough thing to do, though. We kind of realized that a 1-hour show is a certain kind of thing to work with, and the content takes a certain shape. And when we've had even some of our close friends on the show, if you'd push it to 2 hours, which is a really long time to talk, by the time 2 hours comes along, you have nothing else to say that was planned. You've exhausted any predetermined ideas that you came in, or any speeches that were rehearsed. And now you're in really uncharted, weird territories. And at least for us, that's where some of the really interesting conversation happens. Or it could be the opposite, where it's just boring stuff.
Right.
And it's hard to kind of capture that in a bottle and have it be have it happen every show, kind of.
Right.
It's a weird kind of thing to tap into, the mental space, It's sort of meditative in a way.
I think it's like the last 2 people at the party who are still going on at 1 a.m. when
That's a very
everybody else
good,
is gone.
Yeah.
And then the question is, does everyone else want to listen to it?
It's true. Or is it the alcohol that makes it seem interesting to the other person?
I remember those conversations.
So then going back to like the architecture and design within Los Angeles, what trends or things in architecture, or as broad as design, are really exciting to you in Los Angeles right now?
Well, it's the struggle that's exciting to me right now. It's the tension. It's actually the tension between the people that want to see the city grow and those that don't. The tension between those that are still very committed to the car and those that think there's, the car should be obsolete and there's other ways to get around. I mean, it's a really fascinating moment of kind of conflict around the basic elements of LA's city fabric. The car and the house is now in contention. And so that's very interesting.
I mean, that's almost the identity of Los Angeles.
Yes,
at least the one that everyone knows.
Yeah, it's LA's identity. When you talk about a new, tower that's going up in New York or London, it's like that's not such a charged conversation, because it's only building more of what's already there. It's only building on an urban density that's already there over a mass transit or an underground subway system that's already there. And really the only question is, how many more lines do you add? Do you improve the system? In LA, it's like really fundamental. People came here wanting a certain lifestyle with a certain image of what ALA is, and the ship is being steered in a different direction, and it's making a lot of people mad, and it's making other people excited. So that's a kind of ongoing, fascinating kind of conversation. It's like a huge place that it's having its raison d'etre thrown into question. So that's definitely interesting. I mean, then at the same time, I guess, LA is still, luckily, home to incredibly insane, bizarre, individuals. You know, I love living in a place with Elon Musk. You know, I think Elon Musk is absolutely crazy and fantastic. And there's other people. His name just comes to mind right now because you asked about sort of design and architecture. But there's some really kind of amazing individuals here who just have such power of their convictions, you know, to like dig a tunnel underneath their property, you know, to test. I mean, I love that kind of thing. And I know I know one has to kind of like hold one's oar, you know, and be skeptical and stuff. But no, it's insanely great to be in a place that produces that kind of person.
Oh. Very well said. I like that. I'm on board with it. This was really, really cool. Thank you so much for coming on our show, but in your facility. And this has been actually really interesting to see how you guys are set up, and it's pretty sweet. No. Right? We should like make a room like this.
Yeah. Right.
And as you see, it just takes some slats of wood. You know, and you probably make it look even better.
Yeah, I'm actually in the middle of constructing some panels right now.
There we go.
I don't think they're going to fit in the car, which is kind of a mistake, but we'll figure it out.
I'm sure it'll look beautiful. I'd love to see it when you're finished.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes. And David and Marina, it's such a pleasure to meet you. Thank you. Thank you for your interest in DNA.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks.
Cool. And it's a great name, Midnight Charette.
Yeah. But speaking of words that no one knows about, we assumed
Charette. They don't know Charette.
No one knows Charette.
No, they don't. I've had to scratch it from scripts.
Yeah.
I should have.
It's a terrible name. Because one of the things that we hope to do is to reach a much broader audience, and we have kind of different ways of solving that problem. But Charette is a word that's not really well known.
Yeah, no, it isn't. Let's, before I forget, go and turn off the audio.
Oh yeah. So actually, can I grab a quick photo?
Oh yeah.
This is the kind of stuff that we always forget to do.
Social media, you know.
We do. I mean, really, to be honest, I hate kind of being like an old fogey that's always saying things were better in my day. You know, I hate that. But I actually wish that there wasn't just this multiple medias on which can be represented, and the endless social media and photography. It gets wearing,
and you have to understand that each of them works, so you can like get the most out of it. And it's exhausting.
It's
a mystery to us.
I mean, we found for us, because we weren't big social media people prior to the podcast, that it's a distraction from the main thing. Yeah, we just want to do the work.
I know it is a distraction. And
thanks everyone for listening to this week's episode of the Midnight Charette. We have a hotline. It is 213-222-6950. Ooh, one more time. 213-222-6950. Call it. Leave a voicemail. It goes straight to voicemail for any feedback, comments, stories, intimate secrets, crimes that have been committed by you or other people. Are there architects that you don't like? Oh, that's a good one. Maybe there's an architect that you don't like, or an employer you had and you're like, that guy.
Or maybe there is somebody you're in love with.
That's an architect you're in love with. And you want
to propose and you don't know how to do it. Well, just call us. We'll help you out. Send you wedding invites, prepare the garlands for your party, everything.
So that's 213-222-6950. We are on all the different social medias. And here's the big thing also. Leave a review in the iTunes podcast app, Apple Podcast app. That supports us hugely. And if you're confused about how to do that, then
there is a tutorial on our website. You just go to any page on our website, pretty much. Top corner right, click leave a review, and there is a little tutorial explaining every single step you have to do. And if you do not use Apple Podcasts or don't have iTunes because you're more of a Droid person than a Mac person, well, there is other places you can rate us and leave us a review.
Not really. What other places?
You can rate our Facebook page.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
You can rate us on Stitcher. You can subscribe to us. It's also another way to somehow rate us, right? I think Spotify, you could do that. You could also just send us a review by email and we can post it on our website and mention you, that's it. Okay. Get busy, people. Okay. Go back to your computer.
But we really appreciate you listening, and thanks again to our sponsors, ArchiCAD, Nod, and of course the guest of the week, Frances Anderton. It was fantastic. We will talk to you again next week or sooner. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.